Hello everyone, this next video comes from a post that I put up in my group and comes from talking to several dog men who asked me to ask this question. Not several, but a few, friends, older guys, retired guys, what I thought or what others thought about this question, which is did a smaller yard of dogs or a bigger yard of dogs produce better dogs? Now you can make the case for either, but if we look into it more, uh, with a little bit more perspective, some things come up, you know. And what I noticed with the smaller yarded dogs, you were more selective. The people were more selective, meaning they only kept the best ones. Now, either they didn't want to have a bunch of dogs or couldn't have a bunch of dogs. In either case, the dogs they did have were considered to be the best of the best that they could produce. You know, with the larger yarded dogs, meaning, in the past, some people had 100, 200, even more dogs than that. So you would have more of a selection, but in my opinion, they weren't more selective because they're going to keep so-so dogs. They're going to keep dogs that maybe were quit or were cold, or just dogs that they didn't want to call, they wanted to keep. Now, what they were doing with those dogs, that varies too. But in a breeding program, you're going to breed most of them. So over a period of time, over a period of years, you're producing thousands of dogs if you have that many dogs. What are the numbers that are connected to that? Are they producing hundreds of winners, champions, grand champions? I can't find anyone that ever did that. Where with a smaller yard, were they producing winners, champions, and grand champions? Yes, on a small scale, maybe only a few. But the percentage-wise, they seem to have a higher percentage, even though they had lesser dogs. That's due to the fact that they were more selective, that they could give more one-on-one time with them, that they were better kept. There's only so many hours in a day. And some of the larger yards did have help, kennel help. Maybe one yard person, maybe two, And that doesn't mean that the dogs weren't well kept up. They were, Some of them weren't. You'd be surprised how many big yards, famous yards I went to in the past, and the dogs weren't very well kept up. You could see skin problems on them. You could see, the cleanup wasn't very well. The water wasn't well taken care of. But even in those yards that it was, you have a wide selection of dogs, uh, different bloodlines, maybe even just a couple of bloodlines. They had their program down to what they liked, right? But there weren't numbers of winners to back all that up. As far as percentages, meaning, what would be a good ratio of winners to the number of dogs if you have 100 dogs? Is it 50-50? Is it 25-75? I don't ever think I've seen a yard that had 100 dogs on it, grown dogs, and I'm speaking of grown dogs. I'm taking puppies out of the equation. So the grown dogs in that yard, if there were 100 of them, were 80 of them proven? Were 80 of them winners? Were 80 of them, did that include champions, grand champions? Did that include producers, tested dogs, all that? I don't think I've ever seen anything like that. Where on a small yard, and I'll give an example. A small yard, this one, a friend of mine, he had less than 10 grown dogs. at any one time. Sometimes he had 6, and this is over a period of a few years. So to the point where he had less than 10 dogs, he had 2 champions on it, 2 one-time winners, and a couple of dogs open, put it that way. That's less than 10 dogs. People say you can't breed a family of dogs that way. You can't, your selection isn't big enough. Yet he did that, you know. Boyles did the same, didn't have a big yard. I did the same, I didn't have a big yard. In other sporting animals, take Woody Stevens, probably known, and he wasn't known for being a breeder, but he never kept a big stable of horses. He was known more as a trainer. So he never had a bunch of horses in his stable. But the ones he did have, he considered them top notch. He considered them worthy of training, whether they were his or belonged to someone else. And he was very successful. He had, in his day, he won the Belmont. I think it was the Belmont or the Preakness. Won it 5 years in a row. And also during his career, he won 7 Triple Crown races, meaning, one of his horses either won the Kentucky Derby, the Belmont, the Preakness. And within that, he won the Belmont 5 years in a row. No one's ever beaten that record. Along throughout the years with all the other stakes winners he had and all the other successes he had. All from a small stable of horses. Meaning he didn't flood the market like some of them guys do. You'll see some of them. I remember one year, I think it was a Kentucky Derby race. One guy he probably had 5 or 6 horses entered in the race, maybe more. But he just flooded that race with his horses. None of them won. I don't even think one of them placed. He's a very famous breeder, trainer. But even with those numbers, he still couldn't win the race, or even place or show. So there's something to be said with having that one-on-one, that time that you're able to spend with each and every dog, compared to having a bunch of them. Now, having a bigger yard, you may have, number-wise, more winners, champions, and grand champions than someone else who has a smaller yard, but you have to take into account all the other dogs that didn't amount to much, never made the grade. And one of the reasons for that is, like I said, you're going to keep some dogs that are iffy, or you're going to keep some dogs that may have some flaw. Whereas with the smaller yard, you're not going to do that. You're not going to keep an iffy dog if you only have 20 dogs or 10 dogs, grown dogs. You're going to be more selective because you can only afford to have the best. Same thing with Frank Shy. He never had hundreds of game fowl, like, even out here when I was younger, you could go out to a game fowl person's place, they might have 500 birds out there. And Thomas W. Murphy was the same. And both Frank Shy and Murphy, they toe tagged every chick. They single mated every cock, every hen. And they kept accurate records of each bird that they produced. And they only took the very best to the pit. And when Frank Shy retired at 80 years old, the Claymore is a very famous selective tournament, His cocks went 7-0 and 9-0. And they'd won the Claymore I don't know how many times in a row. Thomas W. Murphy, his birds won 50 what do they call them, a young male stag mains, 50 stag mains in a row. And he wasn't like all them other breeders who had hundreds of them, where you just flood, flood, flood. And the way that one of the ways that they got their successes is they had, if they were going to a stag main or a derby, they had several birds to choose from, but they only took the best ones, what they considered were ace cocks. And so they may have had, at an 8 cock main, they may have had 20 birds there, but they're only picking 8 of the best ones that they considered that day were the best. And with dog guys in the past, uh, they would only take what they considered the best dogs, top dogs. They could compete against anybody. Now that may have dropped their numbers a bit because they're so selective. They didn't have a bunch to choose from, and they wouldn't take a dog that they considered not up to par, not be able to beat anything that was in front of them. Or someone else, they're just basically flooding the market. And they have success too, and they have a lot more dogs. They had a lot more dogs, but their losses increased because of that. And I'm talking about people that were breeders and competitors, you know, not so much the competitors who would either buy dogs or borrow dogs. They're only going to use the best that they could find. But a breeder competitor, he'll take a chance sometimes in using whatever he has rather than being more selective and only using the ones that he thought were top flight dogs. Another example would be, went to a yard that probably had 60 dogs on it. 30 of them were probably grown dogs. The others were young dogs coming up and puppies. So out of those grown dogs, he had 3 or 4 retired champions, several winners, a few older dogs that were tested that were not competed with but were proven producers. And some of the dogs he was competing with, he was breeding also. Another yard had 80 grown dogs on it, not one match dog ready to go. And the one that had, the first one that I mentioned, he had at any time between 10 and 15 match dogs ready to go. Could cover any weight from the low 30s to the mid 40s, just about, almost any weight, male and female. Where the other yard had more dogs on it but didn't have near those numbers. That yard had some retired champions, but nothing ready to go, nothing up and coming, And it's just the fact that if you're going to have a certain number of dogs, in my mind, you should have the production, the successes behind it. You should have, a champion or two, maybe a grand champion, some winners, some dogs ready to be shown, prospects coming up, then you have 1 or 2 litters of pups, And like I said, I've been to those yards, 100 dogs on them. Producers on there, some retired winners, but not, and maybe 50 grown dogs and 50 puppies, or young dogs and puppies, but not near the number that you would think that they should have. Famous people. And a lot of people never took that into account. They just looked at the record and say, well, he produced this, came off his yard, champions, grand champions, winners, ROMs, PRs, and all that. But they never bothered to look at the numbers behind them. How many dogs do you have to produce all those? So even if you have 100 champions throughout your career, how many thousands of dogs did you have to go through to get those 100 champions and grand champions? The numbers are low. And You also have to take into account, that some of the pups die of disease, some of the yard accidents, some die of whatever, some don't make the grade. You cull some of them, but somebody who's investing that much time and money into the dogs was reluctant to cull dogs, was reluctant not to breed dogs because they want something back on their investment. That's the way they looked at it. That's what I got from them. The dogs are too valuable not to breed them. The dogs are, I put too much time and work into it not to get something back out of it. Well, who suffers when that happens? Not the person, really. He's going to make sure his numbers, money wise, add up. But the public or friends or whatever who buy his dogs or get his dogs, uh, you know, they might not be too happy. It's happened over and over where somebody sold somebody a dog or gave somebody a dog, told them it's a good one, this and that, and it doesn't pan out. The dog should have panned out before he left the yard. And there's all kinds of reasons why that happened. Some are, deceptive reasons. Some are based on economics, But that's not the way to do it, and it didn't have to be done that way. And like I said, there's lots of people that didn't do it that way. You know, they were selective. They did keep only the best. They were able to keep their bloodline going for years. You know, so in today's times, regarding this topic, that's a good thing because I can't see anybody keeping 100 dogs or 200 dogs like they did in the past. It's not smart. It's not safe. So you may be forced to be working with a smaller yard, but because of that, you can also be more selective and produce better dogs overall. Again, this is my opinion, but it's based on my own experiences and experiences of others. What I noticed and keeping track of the production rate and what they produce and what they had at the time. You know, back in the day, I used to get around, you see a lot of roles, you see a lot of matches. And when you see the same guy, whether he's matching one dog a year or 5 dogs a year that has a small yard, and you see he's winning a lot, losing every once in a while, using the same family of dogs, same blood, and using certain crosses and line breeding, inbreeding, and loose line breeding, all that stuff, and he's consistently competing and winning, then there's something to be said from having that smaller yard. Where compared to a larger yard, that person may be competing more, but and maybe have a higher winning average as well, winning versus losing, but he has a larger number of dogs that he's obtaining his competition dogs from, and those numbers are small. You know, let's say a person like that, they match 10 dogs a year or 10 times a year. That's a lot. But if he has 100 dogs, just going by that simple number, that's only 10% of the dogs he's using. If he matches 10 dogs a year out of 100 dogs, that's 10%. Where someone with a smaller yard was matching 50, 60% of their dogs. So it's something that came up, and I wanted to cover it a little bit. And, let me know what you think. It's okay if you disagree. And put some stats down or some numbers that you think are viable to this video from the past, always from the past. Nothing's meant to encourage anything illegal, nothing current. That's all I know is the past. So maybe my, experience or opinion is outdated. Let me know.